By 1813 and 1814, the British Army was enjoying an unprecedented and unremitting period of success. Or was it? We are accustomed to the Peninsular War narrative that by the closing stages of the Napoleonic Wars, the British Army was an inexorable force that swept all before it. Yet that's not even a fair representation of the Peninsular War, never mind the checkered performance in the War of 1812. Nothing epitomizes the more complex reality better than the British expedition to the Low Countries that took place in the closing stages of the conflict. But what actually happened in this often overlooked campaign? Why were the British so interested in going back to the Netherlands after some pretty disastrous expeditions there in recent memory? And how overrated is the British Army during this period? Tonight, Andrew Bamford returns to the show to talk about the British expedition to the Low Countries in 1813 and 14. We discuss the misconceptions, the characters and the actions at the heart of this story in a double bill on the campaign that is so often pushed to the sidelines in favour of the more glamorous events of Wellington's success in the Peninsula. This is Britain's Forgotten Campaign, Graeme and the Netherlands. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Napoleonic Wars podcast with me, your quartermaster, Liam Telfer. A very, very special episode today, as always, by my side. My virtual side is Shit Emperor, Dr. Zach White. And a slight bone to pick with you before I hand the mic over to you, Zach.
Oh, what now?
Well, this particular episode I've been waiting for a very, very, very long time. Do you remember in one of the Patreon tiers, there was a chance for patrons to pick an episode?
I may be unavailable for comment at the present time.
And I remember
I know exactly where this is going.
And again, this was a long time ago, so I will certainly. I'll forget, but maybe I'll forgive or forget which one.
Well, clearly you haven't forgotten, have you?
No,
you just raised it.
I'm just not over it. I made the special request to have today's guest on to discuss his work. So better late than never. Like I said, a very, very special guest with us today. We have Andrew Bamford. He obtained his PhD at the University of Leeds for a study of the British Army's regimental system, which was subsequently adapted into the excellent Sickness, Suffering and the Sword, with published through the University of Oklahoma Press. He's subsequently written extensively on the British Army in the Napoleonic era and also on the wars of the 1740s. For many years, he was the editor of of Hellion, from Reason to Revolution series, which he founded, and he's now working in a freelance capacity, as well as pursuing a research interest in amphibious warfare during the 18th century. He's currently engaged in writing a short military history of the Peninsular War for Routledge's Wars and Battles of the World series. How are you, Andrew? It's great to have you on.
I'm very well. I only hope I can live up to expectations after that interview. Very kind.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's always a real pleasure. I see it as both ways. It's a real pleasure to have sort of new guests on that I'm sort of completely unfamiliar with their work. But I always love to have guests on where I've read a lot of their work, because it almost feels there's a connection there already, if you'll sort of excuse the over familiarity.
Is this the point where Andrew now sort of shuffles slightly away from your general direction? I'm not sure in which way you would need to move in order to shuffle away from Essex. But I get the sense that maybe Andrew is ever so slightly wondering whether he will end up regretting agreeing to this episode, which is probably true of all of our guests after they finish recording. But no, it's you are quite right to bring me up on this, right? Andrew is phenomenal. We're going to talk, as people have heard from the introduction, about the Low Countries. But before we get there, I just want to embarrass my guest in really good podcasting etiquette and just make the point of how much the field owes Andrew as somebody who set up a series with Hellion that was willing to work to combine the sort of academic credibility of rigorous research with the popular market and get books out at a price where people might actually buy them, which was a radical thought for the time. And what it meant was that when people sort of had ideas, Andrew was one of those rare individuals who was willing to turn around and say yes to ideas and let people have that kind of freedom to go and explore and to go and write. And effectively, Andrew's someone who has given a voice to a whole group of historians who otherwise would not have had the opportunity. And that is a phenomenal legacy for anybody to have at the end of a career, never mind midway through a career. So hopefully your ears are now burning, Andrew. But we are going to get to the business of the episode. I kind of set us up for a fall in the sexy intro there by kind of talking about how everybody loves to kind of put the British Army on a pedestal by 1813-14 because of Wellington, because of Sharp, and the okay, sort of the War of 1812 ends up being a bit mixed by the end of it with what happens at New Orleans, but goes quite well up in Canada. So there's this sort of sense, oh, Britain's doing brilliantly, isn't it, when it comes to its army? And if anything, the Netherlands is the sort of the reminder that sometimes you need to come back down to earth and be a little bit more realistic. Or is it? I suppose that's kind of question one.
I think it is to some extent, indeed. One of the issues, if people have read my other books, as a sickness suffering that was mentioned, I talk a lot in there about the British military system, and particularly the military manpower system, being stretched really to the breaking point by the end of what I'd call the Napoleonic Wars proper. So up to the first abdication, and I think it's not really surprising that things do start going wrong in that last period, simply because a system is overstretched for very valid political reasons, perhaps, but political reasons nonetheless. The army is being expected to do more than it's perhaps capable for, more than the system is designed for. For the campaign that I've written about, that we're talking about, saw one of the major disasters for the British Army in the Napoleonic Wars at Bergen-op-Zoom. I mean, it also saw some fairly credible minor field actions as well. This wasn't a mitigated disaster from start to finish, but yeah, it was an army pushed beyond its limits, and I think that's a telling comment on the state of the British military at the time.
Having asked a question that wasn't on the list, I'm now going to continue to stay with questions that weren't on the list. You will notice that I have rabbit holed before we've even got to question one, folks, which is a record, even by my standards, partly because I know that you've written about this and I'm very interested in us kind of exploring it in a bit more depth. To what extent is Wellington part of that problem? In the sense that, there are troops that should be redistributed and ultimately sent to places like the Low Countries. And Wellington goes, no, they're mine. I've got them. You can't have them. And this order to send them back is, of course, coming from the Duke of York. And Wellington sort of goes, no, you can't have them. It's like a little child that's been given a toy. Obviously, Wellington's rationale is like these are veteran troops and all the rest of it. But there is that sort of slight sense of petulant child stamping feet and going, no, it's mine, you can't have them. Is that something that has an implication on the challenges that are experienced out in the Low Countries during this campaign?
It certainly doesn't help. I mean, the issue, as you know, because you edited the book in which I wrote a chapter about this, was Wellington keeping understrength units in the Peninsular as paired as provisional battalions, and not sending them home to be rebuilt as part of the wider manpower management scheme that York was using to run the army as a whole. So that's the core issue, and I think the campaign does underline it rather well, because the two battalions that York was able to winkle out to Wellington, the 2nd 30th and 2nd 44th, both do serve under Graeme. They've been home for just under a year by the time they get redeployed. Um, they're not back to full strength by any stretch, but they're nevertheless two of Graeme's most effective aligned battalions in this campaign. So yes, it is tempting to think that had York put his foot down, that there could have been a better pool of manpower to be drawn upon for this campaign, and maybe for the War of 1812 as well, depending where it had been thought best to prioritise the resources that were available. I mean, we can talk, I'm sure, some more about the quality of the troops that actually do go out, which again link into some of what York was having to do to scrape the manpower barrel. But yeah, Wellington probably didn't help. But yeah, Wellington's priority, as I've said, was on winning the Peninsular War. York's priority was on winning the Napoleonic Wars. So they're both right in their own fields. But no, York was the commander in chief, and Wellington probably ought to have towed the line on that one.
Okay, so having not asked any of the questions that were on the list, I suppose I should do the right thing, Liam, and actually ask a question that we were going to pitch to our guest. Does that sound like an appropriate approach to podcasting?
To be fair, I'm on the fence. I kind of want to dive in and talk about combat effectiveness of those provisional battalions and the impact of that for Wellington against what the Duke of York wanted. So they've got obviously these half battalions, 6 and 4 companies generally. Are they as effective as a whole battalion? I know obviously the numbers are skewed. The numbers on paper are very different to what what's actually represented by these battalions. The 2nd 44th, for example, aren't cutting around in Spain with 1,000 men, and hence why they are formed into a provisional battalion. But do they still have? Do they still, bring something to the table as a provisional battalion, or is the Duke of York right in trying to expedite these battalions home?
Yes and yes, really. I mean, the 34th and 30th are a little bit more difficult to quantify because they only exist as a provisional battalion for a 4th provisional battalion for a few months. They go home before the army sets off to Vittoria. But I mean, leaving that, and they were the weakest of the 8 units involved, as you know. So I think definitely bringing them home was wise because the actual facts demonstrate that they could be rebuilt into reasonably effective units in a fairly short space of time. The ones that stay with Wellington, he's got 3 fairly strong battalions out of 6 weak ones. They're all veteran troops. They perform credibly in combat, very well in combat under some circumstances, and because they're veterans and acclimatized to service in the Peninsula, they got fairly good effectiveness ratios in terms of men being detached as sick and so forth. The issue is that gives Wellington 3 good battalions. It prevents the rest of the army having 6 okay ones. So the question is whether that's an effective trade-off or not. And again, that depends on whether you're Wellington or York, I think, as to how you would answer that question. And again, my sympathies are probably with York.
I have to agree with you. To be fair, I think Wellington is being somewhat petulant. Surely
not.
Well, yeah, they are mine and I'm keeping them. Whereas the Duke of York's rightly, I've got an army and a global water run here. Settle down, Arthur.
But that's very typical of the guy at this point in his career, thinking about my rant about Wellington's Law, the exclusive episode that we did. Wellington is in that phase of, I'm going to get things that work for me in my unique situation. So it just kind of shows that he's reached that point where either his ego is so massive that he just thinks that he is the British Army at this point in time, which is obviously a facetious way of putting it, but there is that very clear sense that, I'm the one doing the important stuff, make things work for me, versus as Andrew kind of says, this wider situation where, yes, people are interested in what Wellington's got to say, but he's not the only person sort of trying to crack the Napoleonic nut, which is an odd analogy, but you know what I mean.
I've always felt it, and I've been pulled up on this by Wellington's very distinguished biographer, so perhaps I'm being mean, but I always feel a little bit as if Wellington's trying to get his excuses in first towards the end of the Peninsular War. He's built this amazing reputation, and just in case something does go wrong, he wants to have 3 or 4 excuses in the bank to pull out. Well, it would have been fine if only you'd let me keep the battalions. If it would have been fine if only you'd let me keep the cavalry regiments that get recalled. It'd be fine if only you'd sent me some more reinforcements. It's all in the correspondence, and it's the defence in advance just in case. But yeah, I'm perhaps being a bit catty with that.
I just see him as a perpetual whiner. He's whining. He doesn't whine in 1808, but he's not there long enough in 1808 to start whining, really. And if he's going to whine about anything, it's going to be the fact that he's been superseded when he's doing a cracking job, in his view. You get to 1809, you're barely past Oporto and he's whinging about things. He hasn't even got to Talavera, where sorry, we've turned this into a Peninsular episode, folks. I do apologize. We will resume normal service in just a moment. But I do think there is that thing that Wellington just loves to stamp his foot and complain about anything and everything because nothing's ever perfect.
Well, on that absolute bombshell, Zach, I think we should definitely get back to the at least a semblance of the question list. Now, as promised in the sexy intro and many times already in the episode, we are 15 minutes in and we need to start talking about the Low Countries. So zooming out from the Peninsula and actually zooming out from the Low Countries specifically, Andrew, can you set the scene for us? What's the sort of wider strategic picture looking like across Europe and, in fact, the world in the late summer of 1813?
Okay, so we've got obviously the campaigns in Germany coming to a head, with obviously going to culminate in Leipzig, and it's all going very wrong very quickly for Napoleon. I mean, certainly by the time we get redcoats on the ground in the Netherlands, the French are back to the Rhine and looking to defend the homeland. But so that's sort of still to come. Britain is initially logistically supporting the war effort in Germany and sending out a few garrison troops to sort of guard the supply depots on the Baltic and things like that. The main effort, as we've spent some time down a rabbit hole discussing, is of course in the Peninsula, and the second effort is holding the line in Canada. So that's where Britain is. Obviously, the French situation shifts quite quickly once things do collapse in Germany, and you've got the steamroller of use a non-period metaphor of Allied forces sort of starting to push in initially against that last campaign in Saxony, and then pushing for the Rhine and preparing to go into France. And it's in the context of that the Netherlands suddenly become very vulnerable for the French, and a potential opportunity for the Allies, and really set up the background of the campaign that I've written about.
So is that easy to say that the sort of backward movement of the French, as it were, the advance of the Allies in Central Europe, is that the catalyst for Britain looking to mount another expedition into the Low Countries, especially given the numerous previous, I would say failures, but actually some quite disastrous operations there before?
It's certainly the catalyst in making it possible with the resources that are available. So, obviously, with the Walcheren expedition, which is the previous attempt on Antwerp, which is the objective this time around as well, the third city of Napoleon's empire, base for a fleet that's being rapidly built up. That was done with a bigger army than Wellington then had in the Peninsula, and still didn't get anywhere, and bogged down in fever, as we all know. I mean, just to digress, there's a brilliant passage in one of the eyewitness accounts from the 1813-14 campaign, where some of the troop ships are sailing up the Scheldt, and I think it's the 35th who've been on the Walcheren expedition, and the veterans plot where they're going, and there's a fair bit of panic because they think, cracky, we don't want to go back there. We know what happened in Walcheren, and very pleased when they sail on up the river and land on the mainland. So yeah, in terms of making it possible to intervene with a fairly small force, the French collapse is the catalyst. Absolutely. The desire has always been there. Historically, the Low Countries represent the jumping off point for a potential invasion of the British Isles. Be that the Spanish Armada or William of Orange in the Glorious Revolution, or all sorts of things in between. And the a key British war. I mean, you could say from the beginning, the very first deployment back in the 1790s is to try and hold the line in what's then the Austrian Netherlands and the Dutch Republic, and keep the French out. And that's the goal. And the ideal then is that, because we're all starting to think about post-war settlement, even before Napoleon's defeated, it's proper first catch your rabbit territory. He's still on the run, but everybody's already thinking about dividing up the spoils. The idea that a friendly state, if not a pro-British client state, in the Low Countries is a very desirable outcome for Britain politically, because it achieves Britain's aims without requiring a permanent military presence on the ground. The House of Orange is conveniently in exile in Britain. Of course, the hereditary prince, the Prince of Orange, as we know him of Waterloo fame, has been on Wellington staff and had a British military education. But the family are all available to go back in with British support. I mean, to get slightly ahead of ourselves, there's plans for a royal marriage that would tie the young Prince of Orange, hereditary Prince of Orange, to the Prince Regent's daughter. All part of building up a plan for a post-war settlement. And as I said, because the French, when they do recall back over the Rhine, really leave a skeleton force in the bulk of what we think of as the Netherlands, which of course had all been annexed into France. It was all notionally French département by this point. But because they leave such a skeleton force, and because a lot of that force is locals who promptly change sides, there is a vacuum into which the Allies can move, Cossacks and a few Russian regulars, a Prussian corps moving up, but also the opportunity for Britain to send an expeditionary force in as well. So the desire's always been there, and then the circumstances create the means for it to be possible.
When the decision is made that yes, we're going to go, how much of the emphasis is let's work with our allies, particularly the Prussians, and work as a cohesive whole, and how much of it is sort of dominated by this idea that we've got our own sort of set of aims here and we're going to do our own thing? And that's obviously a slightly loaded question, because I know your work on well, in fact, I won't spoil, but effectively you've done something for the Sieges volume that should be out at some point in the next decade, which kind of offers some interesting insights on that. And basically, I'm looking for you to tap into that, because there is a sort of sub question here of, we talk about the British sort of getting it right in terms of coalition warfare under Wellington, i.e. Spanish forces, that's checkered, Portuguese forces, much more successful. But has Britain really sort of got anywhere with its ideas on how to make coalition warfare work in a much broader sense? Because it doesn't go particularly well the first time they go to the Low Countries, and I get the feeling that there are still, well, I would call them creases that need ironing out, but they're much more than creases in my mind.
Yeah, I think the problem, I mean, there's certainly an expectation that they're going to work with allies. The idea of it being a cohesive whole is probably a little bit further removed. This is, I suspect, certainly from the army, and I do wonder, although I don't profess to be an expert on the political angles, but that the fact that Britain had become the dominant allied power in the Peninsula, and now to a lesser extent in the wider Mediterranean, I suppose, the allies were there to do as they were told. And that actually finding allies who had their own agendas was a shock, and realizing that those allies had the troops and resources that you needed to get your agenda through is again, a shock. I mean, the main players. There are a few Russians there, and they caused some issues early on because the Russian general Benkendorf goes and grabs the city of Breda, sort of stuck out ahead of the advance, and then demands assistance from all and sundry. And this is, Graeme's troops barely off the boat, and are already being asked to help an ally and go into a situation that doesn't suit what they're intending to do. The Russians shortly afterwards are withdrawn from the theatre, so they're not really a major concern. There were a few Cossacks floating around throughout, but they're mostly doing their own thing. So the big players to deal with are the Dutch, who very rapidly, it becomes clear, have got their own priorities. The House of Orange wishes to rebuild certainly a what becomes the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but also expand into what we know as Belgium, and of course that does eventually be the Kingdom of the United Netherlands for a few years. There's a Dutch-Belgian shotgun wedding that we all know from the Waterloo campaign. There's expectations, for example, that the Dutch will place their new levies under British command, that Dutch troops may even be recruited into British regiments to help bolster the ranks. In the same way that Wellington had recruited Spaniards, or the Portuguese had gone directly under his command. And just as Britain is playing this with at least one eye on the post-war settlements, so are the Dutch, and obviously they want to demonstrate that they're a viable independent power and a viable military power. And there's not a great deal of cooperation, certainly in the field, although the Dutch are increasingly holding the garrisons as they build up their forces. The one thing I would say of the Dutch, of course, because a lot of them have until very recently been in French uniforms, is that there's a lot of useful intelligence to be gained there. Somebody that's a particular key player, a Dutch engineer officer called Van Gorkum, who manages to slip out of Antwerp and join the Allies, is a key player in a lot of the planning, particularly for Bergen-op Zoom. And he works very closely with Carmichael Smythe, who's a British chief engineer. So having that local know-how and being able to tap into it is incredibly useful, and that is an effective collaboration at that lower level. And then the other players are the Prussians, a Prussian Third Corps under von Bulow, who really doesn't want to be there. I mean, this is the crucial thing. He's notionally part of Bernadotte's Army of the North. Can't stand being under his command. Things haven't gone especially smoothly in Germany. He wants to be with Blücher in the main drive on Paris. He's not uncooperative. I got pulled up in what I thought was otherwise rather a fair Amazon review when this book came out, that it only talked about the British Army in detail. It was subtitled "The British Army in the Low Countries," so it wasn't entirely a fair criticism. But if I was ever going to go back and write a sort of a neutral history of the whole campaign, which I'm sure I couldn't because my German's practically non-existent, but the Prussians do a lot of hard work and hard fighting. The initial attacks on Antwerp, where they're pushing back the French field forces, which at this point still include elements of the Imperial Guard, never mind line troops. They're putting in several days hard fighting just so the British can get close enough to have a crack at Antwerp, and that does get. I didn't cover it in the book because that wasn't what the book was about, but it hasn't been covered in any great detail anywhere else, and it probably should be taken into account when assessing what the Prussians were doing. I suppose the last point to mention on working with allies as well is that Sir Thomas Graeme, who we haven't really talked about in any great detail yet, but it was of course the British commander, is maybe not a man known for his diplomatic skills. Famously falls out with the Spanish in a fairly terminal way in the Barossa campaign. I think to his credit, he realises that he's not the man for liaison duties, and quite quickly you find that when there is an ally to be sweet talked into something, he sends emissaries. Carmichael Smythe, who I've mentioned, the engineer officer, is also quite lucky that one of his brigade commanders, this is again an indication of how quickly the force was put together. But Taylor, who's actually in his regular job, is the Queen's private secretary, and is really quite pleased to get out and do something exciting and command an infantry brigade because he's not seen a deal of soldiering in recent years. But because he's the sort of courtier diplomat type, he's a very effective brigadier when he gets a chance as well. But he's got those negotiating skills, and he's the other one that gets sent out, either as it might be to explain why Britain can't send most of its disposable infantry to bail the Russians out at Breda, or actually that might have been somebody else. I'm not sure Taylor had arrived by then, but or certainly to liaise with the Prussians and try and keep them on side for the various operations. He's one of the team that does that, and Graeme stays in his headquarters and manages not to upset anybody, which is probably a useful recognition of where his skills and lack of skills lay.
I think it's really fascinating, actually, and a point that comes to my mind is, and I don't want to sort of spoil too much, but how much of this operation is all about the Allies just getting boots on the ground before the Allies, and I'm doing the inverted commas, advance too far westward in order to push Britain off the post-conflict negotiating table. We need boots on the ground in order to have an investment in the post-war talks, which I think is fascinating in itself, to use a military force purely for political gain. But looking at some of the leaders you touched on, Graeme and Taylor there, and perhaps differently the supporters of the operation, because I think sometimes the leaders aren't necessarily always all in on some of these expeditions within the British political and military sphere. Is there any sense of reluctance within the army to mount an operation when they have so many resources heavily committed around the globe? And are the resources at hand suitable for such an expedition?
I think the army has to shrug and get on with it. To be honest, one of the things I'd love to do, I think York needs a military biography, and particularly a biography of York as Commander in Chief. If there's a funder out there who wants to pay me to go and do that, then please get in touch. But something I can't answer is what York's private thoughts on it were. What he does do as Commander in Chief is try and do his best to make it happen with the military resources that he has got available. Bathurst, who's the Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, is certainly keen. The government as a whole is keen. It's this symbolic, as you said, it's great having an army of 50, 60,000 sat in the south of France, but when the big players are all in Northern Europe, then you need redcoats there. And they need to be found, even to the point, as I've alluded to, that actually having some Dutchmen in red uniforms would be quite useful, because it's the British redcoat presence on the ground. So yeah, the drive is certainly political. The army has to get on with it. I mean, I've mentioned Taylor being plucked out of a post at court. Graeme's back home from the Peninsula on sick leave. Skerritt, who's another one of the brigadiers, has recently come back from the Peninsula under something of a cloud. A couple of the other officers are men who've held commands under Graeme at Cadiz and sort of come back home when that force was run down as Wellington moves out of Spain. And then, as I've mentioned earlier on, we'd sent troops to the Baltic in early 1813 to garrison places like Stralsund, where the supplies were going in for the Allied armies, and under General Gibbs. And of the 6 battalions that go out there, 4 of those come back. The other 2 come later on to form a brigade. So they're a quite solid body. They've been out on not an active service for the most part. One battalion is in the action at Gorda. The rest of them have been in garrison duties. But again, to go back to something that I talked about at far greater length in Sickness Suffering, this idea of rotating units around to try and build up their effectiveness in second line postings and then bring them into a more active role. You can see that happening there. And as I say, those battalions from the Baltic, and then the 2 ex-Peninsular battalions, 2nd 44th and 2nd 30th, are probably some of the best infantry that Graeme's got at his disposal. He's got a brigade of foot guards, but they're taken out of the 3rd Guard Brigade, the depot formation for the guards. So the 2nd battalions of the 3 foot guard regiments some of the units or elements of them, because none of them are at full strength. You're looking at 6 and 7 company battalions, the guards having the company structure emphasised to a greater strength than the line, so they can put together these composite battalions. There's some experience in there, but there's also men who haven't seen service before. They seem to be particularly poorly officered as well. There's a very fun diary by an Ensign Duncombe of the Guards, and he spends most of his time drinking, womanizing, and going out shooting the local wildfowl. One episode where they turf some commissary officers out of their billets because we're Guards and we want nice billets. And I'm not suggesting that the entire Guards Brigade was badly officered and unprofessional, because it clearly wasn't, but they certainly weren't the pick of the Foot Guards. And I think you get people who maybe approach military history if they come from a wargaming background, and it's guard unit plus +2 for this and +1 for the other thing, and the rest of it, and not all guards are equal, and I think it would be unwise to assume that the Foot Guards who serve under Graeme are the equals of the men who were with the battalions under Wellington, because they're not meant to be on active service. The reason they've got these young, green, inexperienced officers is because they're being trained up in a depot role. The men are being trained up in a depot role. They're not intended for active service, but they get plucked out because they're what's available. And similarly to fill up the infantry, I mean, leaving us out, they send out a veteran battalion because they've got nothing better, and it probably gets stuck in garrison, but at least it's saving using line troops in garrison. You've got battalions that, in a couple of cases, have only been embodied as battalions a matter of months previously. The 3rd 56th is one of them, and I've gone blank. No, I haven't. The 2nd 37th is the other one. And again, they're not sent out at full 10 company strength because they haven't had time to raise 10 companies. They're again about 5 or 6 companies strong, newly appointed officers, men from the depots, newly recruited men. Really units that should have taken probably a couple of years at home, or maybe at best in the Channel Islands, to shake down into worthwhile units, and they're being packed straight off on campaign. I mean, the 56th, to their credit, they've got a veteran CO, John Brown, who led the flank battalion at Barossa. There's a real Cadiz and Barossa mafia, almost by mistake, under Graeme. So at least he's got commanders that he's worked with before, which I don't think is deliberate. Because they're there for various reasons, but he's certainly got a team that he knows, and that is useful. But he's got a veteran CO there, and that battalion does come together surprisingly quickly. But the 2nd 37th, which is even newer raised, is in a pretty poor way and doesn't actually do a great deal of active service, just because it's beyond the capabilities. They pull the flank companies out, which we would assume to contain the most experienced men, and the centre companies are put into garrison pretty early on, and don't do a great deal until Bergen up. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's some cavalry, some KGL cavalry as well, who are fairly good, as one would expect from the KGL, and a fairly decent artillery train. They're at least available, but the infantry is definitely a mixed bag.
I noted Liam smiling wryly as you talked about various guards battalions, and perhaps not all guards are equal. I'm sure Liam could share some stories in his capacity as former household cavalry.
I've still got the Foot Guards purely. I mean, I wouldn't care to cast aspersions on.
He's not gonna come and sort of ride his horse through your front garden. Don't worry.
Okay.
Well, I say he won't. He won't. Probably. What I do want to think about, though, is just Graeme himself. Graeme's gone home, I believe, with an eye complaint from the Peninsula, hasn't he? You've got Barossa. Barossa's sort of quite a sort of pell-mell situation. It's one of those battles where you kind of go, oh, this is a mess, isn't it? How good is Graeme? I know so this sounds like a very loaded question. On the one hand, he is effectively going to be Wellington's second in command. He is the person who everybody thinks would replace Wellington if something happened to Wellington. And yet, is he that good a commander at this point in time? Because I'm sort of going through his record and kind of going, is there anything that really kind of makes me go, oh yeah, Graeme, definitely a successor to Wellington, as opposed to, admittedly, nobody else apart from maybe Hill, who you kind of look at and go, Okay, Will Hill would yeah, Hill would be a decent replacement. Do we overhype Graham? Am I being too mean to him? What's your assessment of the guy?
I think he's a difficult one to quantify. I probably come to like him more as I read more and more of his correspondence, but also question a little more and some of the points you've already alluded to his abilities as a commander. He's very good at making the right decision quickly. Actually, he's very good at making decisions quickly, and they're usually the right decision. I'll rephrase that slightly because there are snap decisions that are less wise. Certainly in his career to this point, yeah, Barros is a mess, but he makes the calls that get them out of the mess again. And some of them, I mean, he fell out badly with the Spaniards, and that didn't help. But nor was the Spanish High Commander, the La Peña, especially competent in that campaign. But for a variety of reasons, he was in a hole, and he got himself out of it with great credit. It's hard to rate him really as a divisional level commander because he's notionally JSC First Division for a fair chunk of the Peninsula, but he misses some of the key bits with health issues. Obviously, he's not a young man. So Salamanca is absent, for example, which would have been interesting to see how he performed in a situation like that. He's often in the same way that Hill and Beresford are used to command effectively a corps in the Peninsula. So maybe in a slightly larger command, but sort of semi-independent rather than independent to what he holds in the Netherlands. I mean, they form the infantry there into two divisions, but they're two weak brigades apiece. It's not quite the same as I know Vittoria, where he's commanding the first division, the fifth division, the French cavalry. I think he gets unfair flack for Vittoria because I mean, it was rabbit hole that we probably haven't got time to go down, but I think he acted within his orders, and then somebody still gets blamed for not cutting the French line of retreat. And then the last one, of course, before he goes home is San Sebastian, which I suspect scarred him a lot more and influences some of his decisions than perhaps we take into account. A certain amount of blame for the failure of the first storming attempt, and then the second one where again things aren't going great, and he has I think a fairly brave, but in terms of moral courage, apart from anything else, to have his siege guns opened up across the heads of his own men. I mean, you're risking friendly fire casualties to try and clear a breach. It's a fairly extreme solution, but it's an effective solution. But I strongly suspect he was quite haunted by the casualties in that operation. Certainly, his approach to siege warfare in the Netherlands is to try and find alternatives to a direct assault, be that a bombardment at Antwerp or an escalade at Bergen up Zoom. And to some extent, those are sensible alternatives because of the situations that he's faced with and the numbers at his disposal, because he's got a weak force that he knows isn't going to be reinforced. But it's telling with things, even when he's trying to arrange a prisoner exchange after Bergen up Zoom, and he's trying to get the French. Was it Ray, wasn't it, at San Sebastian, exchanged as part of that deal. It's clearly in his mind more than perhaps one would expect. And I say my suspicion is it was probably haunting him a little bit. The other point, I suppose, is the one I've already made, that he is aware of his own limitations. Certainly in the diplomatic sphere, he realises that's not his forte, and he finds ways around that. What he is good at is personal leadership, and we certainly see that in the fighting outside Antwerp, where again, particularly at First Max, he's got a fairly hairy situation, and he makes again a dead right snap decision, and restores things quite swiftly. On the other hand, so I corrected myself earlier on. I said he making the right decision in a hurry. Whether the attack on Bergen up Zone was the right decision. Certainly, it was a rushed operation. I'm getting ahead of myself considerably here. We can talk about that some more, I'm sure, when we get to it. But so maybe tactically, he's good at the right snap decisions. Operationally, perhaps he would have benefited from a stronger staff just to steer him a little bit more. But of course, that's not the British setup, really. So
I have to say, I think there's a lot to be said for a commander that isn't afraid to make a decision quickly. I think we all have the huge benefit of hindsight with all this stuff. We know how it ends. Sorry to spoil it for the listeners, but I think at the time when you're dealing with differing levels of intelligence, like you say, potentially quite a weak staff, and again, not necessarily in a system that's built to help with that. There's certainly a lot to be said for a commander being like, right, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. Let's do it. Because I think certainly tactically, I absolutely agree with you. But in the old adage of it takes two to tango, we'd be doing an absolute disservice to the boys in blue if we don't talk about the dispositions of the French within the Low Countries. Who are they being led by? Are we able to comment on their combat effectiveness or their sort of will to fight after what's happened to the French army throughout 1813?
Yeah, apologies. I've not really looked at the French angle other than saying that they've been chased out of Germany. So Antwerp, as I mentioned, is a major French naval base. It's the third city of the empire. It's something that ideally Napoleon wants to hold. And so as things are kicking off, there's a fairly strong garrison there, and it remains a fairly strong garrison there. But there's also a fairly substantial field army in the area, effectively operating outside of Antwerp, the reformed First Corps of the Grand Armée, with quite a substantial amount of Imperial Guard forces, Young Guard infantry, and some of the Guard cavalry attached to it, which I think is a fairly good indicator of how significant a theatre it was deemed to be. They don't remain for the duration of the campaign. I've already alluded to some of the field operations against the Prussians, but just as the Prussians ultimately end up being dragged into the big war in France itself, so too fairly quickly the Guard units are pulled away into that campaign, and they don't actually cross paths with the British contingent. So in terms of what's left, it's local conscripts who, in many cases, desert. I mean, certainly the National Guards of the notionally French department that made out of the Netherlands very quickly switch the tricolour cockades for orange ones and become the Shooterij companies. I've probably murdered that Dutch pronunciation. I apologise. Become their Dutch equivalents and part of the nucleus of the new Netherlands army. But there are French units, certainly in the garrisons that are fairly solid troops. I can't speak to the details of the French elements in the Antwerp garrison. There is in there the remnants of the Irish Legion, which has become, I think, the third étrangère by then. And there's quite a nice account by one of their officers, Auburn, of the siege from the French perspective, for reasons that will become obvious if they aren't already. I've looked at in a bit more detail at the French garrison at Bergen-op-Zoom, and what you had there, and what I would assume to be typical of the various garrison posts that were held, was odd battalions or half battalions of regiments that had been in the campaigns in Germany. Certainly in Bergen-op-Zoom, there were quite a few from regiments that were either up in Hamburg with Davout and cut off, or regiments that had gone into the bag when Dresden fell. So they're sort of the remnants that hadn't gone into the field. I think, as is the case for the French army, pretty much across the board, they're going to be conscript manpower for the most part, but they do fight very effectively in the case of Bergen. And indeed, the French elements of the Antwerp garrison that get pulled out into some of the field actions against the British again do fairly well in a basic defensive action. I mean, I'm not suggesting that they would have been first-class troops for an active field operation, but I mean, let's face it, with the British, similarly, the Prussians were using a lot of land there and so forth. Nobody's got crack veteran troops to spare, and you make the best of what you've got. The other thing I suppose to mention about the French perspective is that they do get a boost so far as Antwerp's concerned, in that Carnot, the old French revolutionary organizer of victories, gets pulled out of retirement, promoted very quickly to General de Division. I think he'd been something like a captain of engineers back in the day, so record for fast promotion, and he gets sent up there and revitalises the defence, and as is the case with many of the French fortress garrisons at this time, holds out successfully to the end of the war, and certainly in the case of kind of attempt to resist a fairly hefty bribe that's offered to him later on to surrender the place, that gets short shrift, and he holds out for Napoleon until Napoleon's no longer on the scene, just as we know some of the garrisons in Germany and elsewhere do. So that's largely where the French are, a field force initially, which quickly gets drawn off, and then fairly solid garrison forces that can hold their positions, but are not really able to actively do a great deal outside of those walls. And of course, there's a fleet. We mustn't forget the fleet. That's the whole reason the British are there. The Scheldt Squadron or Scheldt Fleet. I think it's probably fair to call it a fleet. There's about 20 odd sail of the line by this point. Not all fit for sea by any stretch, and so the effort of getting them down the river and past the British blockade would have been quite substantial, even had the full manpower been there for them. But the French Navy does supply a certain amount of support, naval gunfire and so forth, whenever any of the Allies get sufficiently close to the river that they can bring their force to bear. And as I say, they are one of the key reasons that Antwerp is an objective. So the popular view might have it that the naval side of the Napoleonic Wars was over after Trafalgar. I think we all know that that's not the case, and that Napoleon has been extensively building replacement ships in most of his ports, but certainly Antwerp being a key one. And again, thinking ahead to the post-war settlement, what becomes of these ships is a key objective. And certainly, if the Netherlands becomes a friendly power to Britain, it isn't a problem that the Netherlands has the ships. If things don't go that way, who does get the ships? Even if a French settlement that isn't Napoleon is achieved, Britain isn't really keen on France being a naval power, irrespective of who's in charge. So that's the other issue that comes into play and helps direct the course of operations.
So we're about an hour into this episode, which means I suppose now is an apt moment to talk about boots finally hitting the ground. Except that they don't hit the ground; they hit the snow, because it's taken so long to get them out there in the first place. How well does the whole thing go in its sort of progress towards its initial objectives? And I appreciate that there are many demands made, and tactical requirements mean that the objectives sort of have to shift over time. But is it half the success that people think it's going to be?
Not really, no. Yeah, the weather doesn't help, of course. It's one of the most bitter winters on record. This is a proper frost fairs on the Thames and all the rest of it winter, and not all the troops on any side are especially well equipped for it. Graeme rather sweetly at one point sends in a request to horse guards for ready pounded cocoa to be sent out so the troops can have something hot to drink, which perhaps another thing I should mention when we talk about Graeme, that there's a definite solicitude for the men under his command. But yeah, he's trying to get an army together and organised. They don't all land in the same place. The weather doesn't help with things like that. The Russians, as I say, throw a spanner in the works by capturing Breda and then asking for help. It does take some time to shake everything down, to try and get the Prussians on side, and then to begin the first attempt on Antwerp, which, as I say, is part of this wider Prussian advance that drives back the French covering forces. And then that leads us into, for the British, the first action at Merksen outside Antwerp, which is it's a good Graham action. It's fairly scrabbly and confused, and they go storming in against a village, and then they pull up because they're told the Prussians are in the village, and then they discover the Prussians are actually French, and they have to storm it on the fly. Graeme, in a classic spot the Scotsman moment, immediately calls on his only Highland battalion to go in and do the job, which they do very successfully. The 78th. I know I upset some listeners at this point when I talked about this campaign once before, because the colonel's dog goes into action with him and gets shot, which is very sad. And I apologise to the dog lovers for retelling that story. But yeah, they 78 clear the village. They get a good look at Antwerp, and then the Prussians decide to withdraw. There's been false reports of French movements on the flank. It's actually the French withdrawing, heading back to France, but it's enough to make Lau think twice. They've been in action for several days, and that's really the end of that first crack against Antwerp. So yes, not the great success that perhaps had initially been hoped for. But as I say, carried out in absolutely atrocious weather. We're into mid-January by this point, marching through roads that have been flooded and then frozen and then snowed upon. So you fall through the snow, through the ice, and find cold water underneath around your boots. It really doesn't sound like a great deal of fun at all to be out for days in a situation like that. So yeah, I think the weather slows things down to a certain extent for most of January then, really, before there's chance to do anything else.
With the British, I know the early in the planning stages and throughout the sort of the campaign or the expedition's progress, there's been a lot of promises to the Dutch about, we'll bring lots of firelocks and you can have lots of equipment. And you mentioned earlier about potentially recruiting Dutch into British service. How are the Allies, particularly the British landing from the sea, received by the Dutch? And I guess that can be both ways, from the local populace and as well from the sort of fledgling political, I dare I say revolutionaries, but these guys that have, deserted against the French, they want to establish their new government. How do they receive the British?
It's a bit mixed. I mean, yeah, I'd probably question revolutionaries. They're almost really more reactionaries. The anti-French movement quite quickly gets hijacked and becomes an Orangist movement. So they're attempting to restore the House of Orange, but it's almost restoration plus, because they're not just going to be stadtholders. They're hopefully going to be I think he's the sovereign prince for a while before he becomes king. But it's a quite a strong Orangist royalist movement, and I think there's an attempt to keep the British at almost at arm's length. I don't think King Willem wants to give the impression that he's come back, at the point of British bayonets, as it might be. He needs to demonstrate that he's his own man, and that he's been called back by his people. And certainly, the cry of Orange Bourbon is the popular rallying cry. That narrative is quite well seized by the House of Orange and its supporters. So as I say, not a great deal of practical help, because he's maybe more interested in building up his own army and keeping it as a force in hand for his own control, than sending out penny packets to reinforce the British. There's a couple of occasions later on, and if I'm honest, I'm scratching for the details here, where a brigade is promised for a bit of support, but nothing serious ever materialises. But by April 1814, the Dutch have the equivalent of a weak army corps in the field, if it were all concentrated in one place, which is their attempt to have their own boots on the ground and bargaining chip. In terms of local relations, they seem to be fairly positive. Eyewitness accounts, talk about being fed by local families, receiving food. Several of the younger officers report positive relations with the local young ladies. I mentioned Duncombe of the Guards. There's another Moody, who's a 21st Fusiliers officer, strikes up a very successful relationship with the daughter of the house he's billeted on, and I think he's largely distracted from his military duties for the duration thereof. So yeah, soldiers being soldiers is perhaps not an entirely unfair characterisation there, but yeah, at a local level, it's not problematic. These people have got decent local gin, and they've got warm houses that they're happy to let soldiers shelter in. It's not a difficult scenario in that respect for the Redcoats.
So the other contingent within all of this is the Prussians. Is there a sort of sense of, oh, fantastic, we've got some friends here? Or is this sort of a sense of, well, you need to come and do something meaningful, or is there sort of, am I overplaying it? Do they at least try and get on with each other and achieve their objectives, or is actually this idea, well, we all have disparate objectives, what interests you doesn't interest me, actually sort of the core of a very knotty problem that afflicts this campaign?
Yeah, I think it's probably not helpful that we get a fair bit of this, or we got a fair bit of this before I started writing about it, dare I say, through Fortescue, who was writing that line of his history after the First World War, and for obvious reasons wasn't especially pro-Prussian. So that colours the narrative. There isn't a great deal of interaction at a soldier-to-soldier level between the British and the Prussian armies. They operate fairly distinctly, even in the two Antwerp operations. In both cases, the British form the northern flank of a larger advance. There's a friendly fire incident in the withdrawal from First Merksen, which doesn't help, and there's a lot of mistaken identity because the Prussians have been told the British are coming, and everyone knows the British wear red. Well, the British are wearing greatcoats because it's freezing, and so is everybody else. Even assuming that the British might be familiar with the wide variety of uniforms that the Prussians were wearing at that time. But yeah, other than that, there isn't a great deal of direct interaction. It's mostly a case of the top level negotiations, which, as I've already alluded to, with people like Carmichael, Smythe, and Taylor doing the diplomatic on Graeme's behalf. I don't think Buller's unwilling to help. I mean, he does when we get the second advance on Antwerp, which then culminates in the bombardment that I've written about for your Sieges book, Zach. The Prussians have agreed to support it. They do support it when they receive orders to move out and join Blucher in France, because Napoleon's mounted his little counteroffensive there. They don't just march off and leave the British in the lurch. They give Graeme fair warning. They actually stay a little bit longer than Von Bülow would perhaps have liked, at least in order to give the British a chance to carry out the bombardment operation that they're mounting. It does, to be sure, impose a time limit on the operation, but equally, the time that they did have available was more than enough to make it clear that it wasn't going to achieve what was hoped. So yeah, Fortescue is definitely a man of his times in terms of the way he characterises that relationship. The reality is rather different, but yeah, the Prussians don't want to be in the Netherlands. They've got their own priorities. They certainly, Bülow's personal priority is to get out from under Bernadotte and back with Blucher and take part in the final advance on Paris. He doesn't want to be stuck in a backwater. And in terms of Prussia's wider war aims, the Netherlands isn't up there in the same way that it is for the British. So it's a secondary theatre for them, and I think they're fairly happy to get out when the orders do come for that.
And on that note, folks, having barely got anywhere near the fighting, we're going to break and ask Andrew to come back for a second installment. That's, of course, assuming that he hasn't run away screaming after us opening the interview talking about nothing remotely related to the topic. That wasn't our best moment in the history of this podcast, was it? Let's be honest, Liam. Andrew, it's always a delight to have you on. Folks, you absolutely need to go and get your hands on Sickness, Suffering and the Sword, which is about the much sort of wider regimental system in the army during this period. And Andrew, remind listeners of the volume dedicated specifically to this campaign.
So there are actually two, just to really get the book plug in. There's a bold and ambitious enterprise is the campaign history. As I mentioned with reference to the Amazon review, it is a history of the British Army in that campaign. And then because there were so many good eyewitness accounts, including a couple that I only discovered after I'd written the first book, I did one called Triumphs and Disasters, which is simply a compendium of 6 of the eyewitnesses, including several of those that I've mentioned already. So those are the two, both published by Frontline Books, which is a pen and sword imprint.
Which therefore means, folks, you know which websites to go to. So head to Peninsular Books for the 1813-14 campaign titles, and head to the University of Oklahoma Press for Sickness, Suffering, and the Sword. Don't make me inflict an angry rant about Jeff Bezos and rocket fuel on you. Andrew, such a delight to have you on. Thank you so much for your time. I am ever so slightly disappointed that we didn't get sort of audio bombed by your dog, trying to make helpful additions to your commentary on this campaign, because spaniels do love to shove their nose in every single conceivable part of business. But perhaps we'll save that for part 2.
We can only hope. She's curled up asleep next to me, so she's been the ideal canine research assistant for today. But I'll try and get her on the audio for next time. You'll regret asking that.
Something to look forward to then. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. Folks, do me a favour. Go review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the single most powerful thing that you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars Pod merch. Again, the link is in the description. And did you know you can now gift memberships to Patreon perks that we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive meetups with authors, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of the perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars Pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to vastly increase our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on an almost daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some more documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in January of 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, and Daniel Fieldman. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.